The turning point in the life of this misunderstood machine came when the Southern Pacific Railroad, a company famous for its ruthless efficiency and difficult operating conditions, decided to take a massive gamble on the SW1500. Despite the industry's widespread belief that it was inadequate for serious work, the Southern Pacific, or the SB as it was affectionately and fearfully known by its crews, operated some of the most challenging trackage in the United States, including the punishing grades of the Sierra Nevada mountains and the sprawling, chaotic industrial webs of Los Angeles and San Francisco. In 1967, the yardmasters at the massive Taylor Yard in Los Angeles were facing a crisis. Their older switchers were too slow to keep up with the booming economy, and their big road engines were too long and clumsy to navigate the tight, twisting curves of the industrial branch lines where the real money was made. Desperate for a solution, the Southern Pacific placed a massive order for the SW1500s. But they didn't just use them for shuffling cars in the yard, as EMD had intended. Instead, they equipped them with a special piece of technology called flexicoil trucks, which was a type of suspension usually reserved for high-speed passenger trains. This modification was the secret weapon that transformed the too-short engine from a wobbly yard goat into a stable, high-speed road switcher capable of hitting 60 miles per hour on the main line, a feat that was previously unheard of for a locomotive of its stature. Suddenly, the crews at Taylor Yard realized that this short, punchy locomotive was actually the perfect hybrid. It was small enough to squeeze into the tightest warehouse sidings where the giant SD45s would derail. Yet it was fast enough to sprint between towns on the main track without delaying the high-priority express trains. A legendary story from the Baldwin Park branch tells of a veteran engineer, often referred to by the younger crews as Old Man Miller, who was assigned an SW1500 for a heavy haul that was technically far above the engine's weight rating. The story goes that the dispatcher laughed and told Miller he would need a helper engine to get the train up the grade, predicting that the short locomotive would lose its grip and stall out halfway up the hill. Ignoring the warning, Miller opened the throttle of his single SW1500, and to the shock of everyone watching, the little V12 engine roared to life, digging its wheels into the steel rails with such ferocity that it not only pulled the massive cut of freight cars up the hill, but did so ahead of schedule. The short frame, which critics said was a flaw, actually concentrated the locomotive's weight perfectly over its driving wheels, giving it incredible traction that the longer dispersed frames of the giant engines couldn't match in tight situations. The crews began calling them cruds, a nickname that sounded like an insult, but was actually a term of endearment for a machine that was tough, dirty, and absolutely unkillable. They discovered that while the glamorous mainline engines got all the glory for pulling trains across the desert, those engines were useless if the cars weren't first assembled, sorted, and delivered by the switchers. The SW, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often without being shut down for months at a time. However, just as the SW1500 was proving its worth, a new problem emerged. The railroads realized they had underestimated just how much freight these little engines were moving, and the too-short complaint was about to be replaced by a shocking realization that would change railroad economics forever. The Southern Pacific crews knew they had a winner, but the executives were about to find out that this little engine was beating their biggest investments in the one metric that mattered most. Let's head to the final section to see the numbers that shocked the world. Visual cue: modern-day footage of a rusty, faded SW1500, still working in a grain elevator or short line, contrasted with a shiny new locomotive breaking down. By the 1970s and 80s, the data coming in from railroads across America revealed the startling fact that completely overturned the too-short narrative. While the massive multi-million-dollar road engines like the SD42-2 were technically hauling trains over long distances, the humble SW1500 was actually responsible for moving more individual freight cars than any other engine in the fleet. This was because of a simple logistical truth. Every single freight car that crosses the country must be touched, shuffled, sorted, and spotted by a switcher at least 4 or 5 times during its journey at the origin factory, at the departure yard, at the intermediate sorting hub, and finally, at the destination customer. The short engine was doing 4 times the work of the long engine, handling millions of tons of goods that simply could not move without the agility and reliability of the SW1500. The locomotive that was once dismissed as being too short for the main line ended up outliving almost all of its giant contemporaries. While the massive 3,600 horsepower beasts of the 1960s were scrapped and melted down because they were too fuel-thirsty and expensive to maintain, the SW1500s kept chugging along. In fact, if you go to almost any industrial park, grain elevator, or short-line railroad in America today, from Chicago to New Orleans, you will likely still find an SW1500 hard at work. 50 years after it was built, doing the job that modern, computerized locomotives are too complex and fragile to handle. The ultimate irony is that the short design became its greatest asset, allowing it to survive into the 21st century, where it continues to serve as the lifeblood of the American supply chain. The railroads that once complained about its size eventually realized that the SW1500 was arguably the most successful locomotive design in history, not because it was the biggest or the fastest, but because it was the most useful. It proved that, in a world obsessed with size and power, the ability to simply show up, do the dirty work, and never quit is the most valuable trait of all. The story of the SW1500 serves as a mechanical parable for us all. It doesn't matter if the world thinks you are too small, too short, or too weak, because if you have the traction to keep moving when the load gets heavy, you will eventually outlast the giants. It turns out, the short engine had the longest life of them all. If you enjoyed this story of the underdog that kept the world moving, please like this video and comment below. What is your favorite ugly duckling locomotive that deserves more love? I read every comment, so let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next run. Visual cue: grainy, black and white footage of a busy, smoky rail yard in the 1960s. Massive steam engines are being scrapped, and giant diesel locomotives are roaring past. The camera pans down to a small, boxy locomotive sitting quietly in the shadow of a behemoth. In the high-stakes world of American railroading during the mid-1960s, bigger was always considered better, and the industry was obsessed with massive, earth-shaking machines that stretched as long as a city block and possessed enough raw horsepower to pull a mountain off its foundation. Railroad executives and engineers were locked in a fierce arms race to build the longest, heaviest, and most powerful locomotives the world had ever seen, convinced that the only way to save the dying freight industry was to construct titanic engines that could haul 10-mile-long trains across the continent without stopping. Into this arena of giants stepped a tiny, unassuming machine called the SW1500, a locomotive so compact and seemingly underpowered that when it first rolled off the assembly line at the Electromotive Division EMD plant in La Grange, Illinois, veteran railroaders actually laughed at it. They looked at its stubby frame, which was barely 45 feet long, and its small fuel tank, and they immediately dismissed it as a toy that was simply too short to be of any real use in the brutal, heavy-duty world of modern freight logistics. The criticism wasn't just about its physical size. The complaint that it was too short was a damning metaphor for its perceived lack of range, lack of power, and lack of capability, with many yardmasters arguing that such a short wheelbase would never be stable enough to handle the rough, uneven tracks of America's industrial sidings at any decent speed. The railroad barons wanted road warriors that could scream across the Great Plains at 70 miles per hour. But what EMD offered them was a squat, boxy yard goat that looked like it belonged in a children's book rather than on the high iron of the Southern Pacific or the Pennsylvania Railroad. The skepticism was so intense that many believed this little engine would be a commercial failure, a momentary blip in history that would soon be scrapped and forgotten in favor of the six-axle monsters that were dominating the headlines. However, there was a secret hidden under that short, stubby hood that the critics completely ignored. A revolutionary 12-cylinder 645E enginette was pound one of the most durable pieces of machinery ever built by human hands. While the executives were busy complaining that the unit was too small to make a profit, the ground crews, the men with dirt under their fingernails, who actually built the trains in the freezing rain and scorching heat, began to notice something strange about this useless little engine. It didn't slip on the rails when the weather turned bad. It didn't break down when it was pushed beyond its limits. And it had a violent, snappy acceleration that could kick a line of heavy boxcars into motion faster than engines twice its size. The mystery of the SW1500 is not that it succeeded, but that it was hated so much at the start, only to silently become the single most important tool in the rail yard. But before it could claim its crown, it had to survive a trial by fire on the most dangerous and demanding railroad in America, where a specific group of rail in Los Angeles were about to put the too-short engine to a test that would either destroy it or make it a legend. Sound effect: the deep thrum of a diesel engine idling, followed by the sharp hiss of air brakes releasing. But why did the most powerful railroads in the world eventually beg for these tiny engines? The answer lies in a mechanical secret that changed history. Before we reveal how this run outpulled the giants, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story about the machines that built our world. Visual cue: map of California, zooming into the sprawling Taylor Yard in Los Angeles. Footage of bright gray and scarlet locomotives, the bloody nose paint scheme of the Southern Pacific.